Hello and welcome. It is just 5 o'clock now, and I am going to wait a couple seconds as people begin to join us, but I just want to say thank you for joining us to the folks that are already on, and hello to those that are coming on. I'm going to just show you a slide that kind of gives you an understanding in case you're struggling with your audio, but thank you for joining us. My name is Mara Walsh, and I'm your host today. Now that we have all connected, hopefully, we're ready to go. I am a travel group leader. I see a lot of people on this virtual tour that I know and a ton more that are new to me, so welcome. And some that have even toured with our tour director, George, in the past. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Audio, if you need to turn up your audio, you can do this in one of three ways. One, you can attach a headset or earbuds. That is the best way to hear on any device, whether it's a computer, a laptop, or a phone. You'll get the best quality audio from those headsets. You can turn up your computer audio, or you can go to the little arrow next to the mute icon on the Zoom menu and go to audio settings. And there you can turn up the output volume for your speakers. One of those three ways should ensure that you're hearing everybody and everything that's said. Your screen, when you are looking at me right now, I should be on the right and there should be a large image screen to the left. If you can manage with your mouse or your finger to move the vertical bar over to the right all the way to minimize the speaker so that you can see the slides or the image at its largest image area. So hopefully now that we are optimized the best way for the technology results of this, I'll share a little bit about myself. As I said, my name is Mara Walsh. I am in the United States right now, specifically between Philadelphia and New York. So I am Eastern Daylight Time right now. I started leading tours with EF Tours as a Girl Scout leader, taking girls and their families to international destinations every summer. I've since expanded my travel program. I've added adult-only tours as well as family-friendly tours. These are our physical tours. In nearly all of my tours, I partner with EF Tours or their adult division, which is called Go Ahead Tours. There are a couple reasons I started these virtual tours. One, I really wanted to support the tour director community during this COVID-19 time of no work. Since we're not able to travel, most of the tour directors that we group leaders work with have not been able to earn money since well before March of 2020, considering that travel has shut down. And it looks like they're not going to be able to go back to work for several more months to come. So this was a way I could support them. I also really wanted to keep the excitement of travel alive for my travel group and extend that opportunity to those who love to travel and love to learn from these types of tours. I have found through social media, friends and families telling one another and other means out there that this virtual tour community has really grown, and you guys are telling us that you love these tours, you want us to continue them. So we will continue them into the winter months and see where it takes us. We've done several tours in the past weeks, including, well, we started with Rome, we added Edinburgh, Paris, London, Peru, Ireland, Greece, Ecuador, Prague, Egypt. We've been all over the world, and we will continue to go into new territories. I know many of you have joined us, but if you've missed any of those and you want to view the recorded version of the tour, they are all available on my website, girltraveltours.com. with a /virtual-tours. But if you go to girltraveltours.com and click on the virtual tour button at the top of the navigation, you'll get to all those tours. We have several more tours lined up in the coming weeks. We have, of course, today, we have a literary tour through the United Kingdom. We have Russia coming up. We have Madrid's Prado Museum, China, the Amalfi Coast, New Zealand, an African safari, an Oktoberfest in Germany. So we are also adding Japan in the future. We have more and more tours coming up, and we're planning them all the time. So keep with us and enjoy the tours. You can register for any future tour at the same link, which is girltraveltours.com/virtual-tours. You can get there from the top menu on my website. But today we're off to England and to the United Kingdom to explore the region of literature's finest writers and poets. Before we get going, I want to share with you a few ways that you can interact with us during this event. One, feel free to ask questions about the tour director, or my travel program through using the Q&A. That's a little icon on your Zoom toolbar. You could just click on that and put your question in. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the tour where George will answer all your questions. You can also use the chat feature. The chat feature may be accessible from the More icon on your toolbar, or it may be visible. And you can chat me a question, but please know that if you chat me a question, it will not be read during the Q&A session. So these are only specific questions that you want me to see, or that that you want to just send out a shout out or something of that nature. So let's get started. I always like to start with an interactive poll. This kind of just gives us an understanding of the familiarity you have with the region. So I'm going to launch this poll, and the poll says, if you don't see the poll jump up, you can hit the poll on your toolbar, and that should help you get to that poll. What is your connection to literary England and the regions we're visiting today? So the answers are, I've been on a similar tour and loved it. I have a literary tour booked like this one, or I'm interested in literary tours in the future. Physical tours, or I'm solely interested in experiencing virtual tours. I'm going to wait a moment while we gather the results. And right now we have about 50% of the people who've chimed in, and now we're getting quite a few people more. So I'm going to give you a countdown of 3, 2, 1, and I'm going to end the poll. It looks like there's a lot of people who are interested in this type of physical tour in the future. So George, it looks like you might be able to work in the future on physical tour. And then there's a ton of people that are interested in our virtual tours, which is awesome. We love you guys, that's fine. Just keep coming back and that's fine. Here you'll see the results. And I'm gonna stop sharing them. So I'm gonna move forward now. So regardless of how much you know about this region right now, or the literary figures that we're going to talk about that really have had an impact on this region, I believe that you're going to enhance your understanding and your knowledge of that area today on this virtual tour. And as we all know, a tour would not be complete without a fantastic tour director. And again, a tour director is like a personal travel concierge. They stay with you and your group from start to finish, and they share a world of knowledge. They manage all of your travel plans, and they make sure your experience is stressless and full of positive experiences, which allow you to make lifelong memories. These are by far, in my opinion, and most people's opinion, the most important people in the group that you're traveling with. And as I said, if we're not traveling, these tour directors have no work. And I'll share with you via chat and during the Q&A how you can tip the tour director. Please know that 100% of all the tips go directly to the tour director once they're collected. And I'm hoping that this virtual tour will not only reignite our desire to travel, but allow a tour director to do what he does best, which is share his knowledge and passion while earning some tips as well. And one of my absolute favorite tour directors, who many of you were fortunate enough to travel with last summer along with me, just happens to be a resident of the United Kingdom and a literature buff, and was excited to come back for another virtual tour this summer to share his passion. So it is my honor to introduce you to and hand over this event to our amazing tour director, George McFall. I am going to stop sharing my screen so George can jump in and lead this tour.
Hello, how you doing? Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, How you doing? Lovely to be here. Myra, thank you so much for asking me back to do this tour. I've got to say it's been a real lifesaver getting to do these tours this summer. Those of you who don't know me already, my name is George McFall. I am a tour director for EF Tours. I generally work around the British Isles, also Italy, Germany, France. But I love doing this tour in real life. I'm sure I'll love doing it virtually as well. It's a tour, a literary tour of the United Kingdom. If anybody can't hear me, you can maybe let Mara know and she can let me. I'll try and speak as loudly and clearly as I can. I'm currently in Edinburgh in Scotland. Scotland will not feature in today's tour though, I'm afraid. This isn't my personal reason. This is because the normal tour that I do in real life doesn't include Scotland, although it is a literary tour of the UK. Now we'll start off with a geography lesson. I'm sure most of you know, but the United Kingdom, do you know what the UK is exactly? Oh, hang on. Okay, the UK, the United Kingdom is England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. You see Northern Ireland, the rest of Ireland, for example, around where it says Dublin, that's not part of the UK. That is a separate country, the Republic of Ireland, and it is also part of the European Union, which we, sadly, are no longer a part of. So Northern Ireland is where we're going to start our tour today, our literary tour of the United Kingdom. And we're going to take this tour all the way from Belfast in Northern Ireland, through England, through Northern England, down, ending up in Oxford, and then we're going to get you down to the airport in London to fly you out of here. And maybe we'll have time, hopefully, just to look at a couple of writers from London, if we have time, fingers crossed. So we have a great literary tradition in this country. Some of you, I'm sure, will think of obvious people like William Shakespeare. Lots of people would like to think that we are the kings of literature, of prose and poetry. We're very good. Other countries are great as well, it must be said. Italy, Greece. Greece is pretty good, France, Germany. But one of the things that we have in this country that we're so lucky to have is the wonderful language that I'm communicating to you in right now. And our language was made as a result of our history through wave after wave of people arriving, often by invasion, sometimes peacefully. So the original people here would have been the Celts, and the Celts had a very, very strong literary tradition, but nothing was written down. In those days, they had an indigenous religion which was led by these guys, the Druids. This is not a photograph of a Druid. I'm afraid there's no photographs of Druids back. I'm talking around the time before the Romans. The Romans settled in the UK around 55 AD. So before that, the Druids, they were like the priests, the teachers, the judges, the directors, the writers. They did it all. Okay, they were the linchpins of the community. And storytelling was a huge part of society at that time. Obviously, we didn't have Netflix, Facebook, television. We didn't even have the radio. So these people would study for long periods of time storytelling. They would learn very long, epic poems and narratives that they would then travel around the country reciting. It was a very serious business, telling stories. And this was how we spread myths as well. Like all cultures, we had myths. We had our own gods. We worshipped the sun, the moon, agricultural gods. For example, Puck was the god of mischief and mirth, the god of not taking yourself too seriously. And then after that, we had the Romans came along. And then after them, we had the Anglo-Saxons who came from Germany. And with them, they brought the German language, an old Germanic language. You wouldn't really recognize it as being German, but it's where we get the German part of English, because English is actually really German meets French with a bit of Latin thrown in as well, by and large. Okay, that's a simplification, but that's what it is. And the Anglo-Saxons, maybe one of the earliest works of literature that we can put down to this country is this, Beowulf. Beowulf is an Anglo-Saxon epic poem written in ancient Old Norse dialect. It's unrecognizable, the language, to you and I. I could read it now and you wouldn't understand a word, but it's a brilliant long poem. It's been translated lots of times. Great translation by the Irish poet Seamus Heaney, but it's all about a fearsome warrior who goes to slay the ferocious beast Grendel. It was made into a movie not long ago, starring what's her name again? Angelina Jolie. She plays Beowulf's mother in it. If you're interested, you can watch that. It's in normal English, fear not. So that would be one of the earliest examples of literature. And then all the way up to the modern day. What's the last big, enormous blockbuster book that we are responsible for in this country? It's probably this, isn't it? Harry Potter. I'm sure that quite a few of you are Harry Potter fans out there. I like Harry Potter. I can't pretend I've read the books. I'm probably a little bit old, but it was written in my hometown, the town that I'm speaking to you from tonight, Edinburgh. I'm not going to talk about it on this tour, I'm afraid, but if you have questions about it, I will try to answer. I may not be able to, but I will try. I know J.K. Rowling's sister is married to a friend of mine. There you go, my first name drop of the evening. Okay, but first we're going to head to Northern Ireland, to Belfast, for another children's fantasy series of novels. So we're going to head to Belfast. You can see Northern Ireland just across the sea from Scotland. Here's a map of Belfast. So you're going to land on your plane. I'm going to pick you up. You see Hollywood Airport just to the right of Belfast, where the red dot is. And first of all, I'll show you the town of Belfast. This isn't really happening, by the way. I'm pretending we're on tour, okay? Normally this tour would take a week, and today we're going to try and do it in 30, 40 minutes, all right? So here we go. So first of all, I'm going to show you the sights of Belfast. This is the centre of Belfast. Anybody that's been to Ireland before will see that this doesn't look like Ireland. This looks like England, okay? And that's because Northern Ireland is part of the UK. A lot of it was built by English Protestants because James I of England, who was James VI of Scotland, he basically wanted to make Ireland Protestant. So he sent a bunch of Scottish Protestant landowners over to Ireland, gave them lots of free land that belonged to the Catholics before, in the hope that they would suppress the Catholic population. This brought about centuries of bad blood, violence, and animosity, which is still with us today. But this is why Belfast looks very English architecturally. The other thing Belfast is very famous for is this, shipbuilding. This is the most famous shipbuilding company in Belfast, H&W. This crane, the yellow crane, this is one of the great landmarks in Belfast, and the company is called Harland and Wolff. And the most famous ship that Harland and Wolff built was the Titanic. The Titanic was built in Belfast. And if you go to Belfast, which I would highly recommend you do, it's a wonderful city, great people, very interesting. There's a fantastic experience. You can do the Titanic experience. You get to see how it was built. You get to see how the terrible tragedy of its demise came about. It's a great experience. I highly recommend it. But that's general Belfast stuff. Now we're going to talk about, one more thing that Belfast is famous for is what we call the Troubles, okay? So the Troubles were, I told you about the Protestants coming over. From the Republic of Ireland became independent in 1922, but the Protestants in Northern Ireland wanted to remain part of the UK. So the British and the Irish came to a deal where Northern Ireland remained part of the UK, but this caused a lot of bad blood. The Catholics felt that they had very bad civil rights in Northern Ireland, and I would say quite rightly so. The police force in Northern Ireland were all Protestant, and basically what this brought about was a lot of violence between the two communities in Northern Ireland from the 60s right up until the 90s, when we had a peace agreement under Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. But still to this day, the people involved in this terrorist violence from both sides, both the Catholic and Protestant side, they're still alive, they're still very much at large. The violence has subsided for now, but they still antagonize each other with these murals. This is in the Protestant part of town, and this is the UVF, the Ulster Voluntary Force. That's the Protestant paramilitaries, and they antagonize the Catholics with these murals. The Catholics around the corner antagonize with these ones. These are murals depicting Irish prisoners of war. They considered the IRA prisoners to be prisoners of war. And there's one, they strongly identify with the people of Palestine in the Middle East conflict. But that's Belfast, okay? And who we're going to talk about first, the first writer in Belfast is this guy here, okay? His first name is Clive. His second name is Staples. Anybody called Clive here tonight? I'll be very impressed. Not many people call Clive these days. So it's a good name, but Clive Staples Lewis, you may know him better as C.S. Lewis, okay? C.S. Lewis was born in Belfast in 1898. He was English, he was Protestant, he was from an affluent suburb of Belfast. He was born in this house in 1898. Like so many of the writers we're going to talk about today, he had he didn't have an easy childhood. His mother died when he was very young. He had a very distant father, and he spent a lot of time by himself. And he learned to read at the age of 3. He was incredibly bright. He started writing stories when he was 6. He was obsessed with anthropomorphic animals. That means anthropomorphic, like animals that dressed like humans, acted like humans. He loved the stories of Beatrix Potter, Peter Rabbit, more about her later. And also mythology, Greek mythology, Norse mythology. He was completely obsessed with it. He became very bright and he achieved a lot academically. However, in 1918, the First World War broke out and he signed up and went to the front. And as I hope a lot of you know, that was one of the most brutal episodes of history. And he came out of the war, like everybody, very traumatized. And after this, he went to Oxford University, not a very happy man. And he did 2 degrees in the same amount of time that it takes a normal person to do 1 degree. He did Greek and Latin, and then he followed that with English literature. And soon after that, he became what we call an Oxford Don. That's a professor at the University of Oxford, Oxford University. And he was an Oxford Don in English literature, and he remained there for 30 years. And he became a very successful academic. Most of you will know him because of the books, the children's books he became famous for, which is the Chronicles of Narnia, okay? The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But before he did that, he was a very successful academic. He wrote extensively on medieval texts, a very famous book called The Allegory of Love, which is all about courtly love in medieval Europe. But what you will know him for is the Narnia books. When he was 16 years old, he said that he had a vision one day of a faun. A faun is a half goat, half human from Roman mythology. And the faun was holding an umbrella and some parcels, and he was in the snow. And he said that image stayed with him throughout his life. And then much later, in his 40s, he decided to turn it into something. And so he started writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which turned into the first of 7 books about the Chronicles of Narnia, which is about 4 children in England who were evacuees during the Second World War, who went to stay at a house in the countryside. They discover this wardrobe, which gives them access to this magical land called Narnia. And it went on from there. The books were a huge success. He became very successful indeed. And his life ended quite happily after quite a challenging start to it. The other thing, very significant thing that happened to him was that he converted to Christianity at the age of 32. Now, a lot of people say that the Narnia books are analogies. They're sort of analogies for a lot of Christian issues. For example, the Aslan, the lion, is meant to represent Jesus in some way. For example, at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, spoiler alert if you haven't read it, Aslan sacrifices himself for the life of Edmund, and then he comes back to life, he rises against. There's a lot of religious parallels in it. Interestingly, he was very atheistic before he converted at the age of 32, and his reason for converting was his best friend, who was J.R.R. Tolkien, who is the author of The Lord of the Rings, who was also an Oxford professor. He was a very devout Catholic, and he managed to persuade C.S. Lewis to convert to Christianity. He talked him round. This is C.S. Lewis. These are the mountains of Mourne. These are to the south of Belfast, and C.S. Lewis said that this landscape was his inspiration for Narnia. Okay, so it's just where the Republic of Ireland meets Northern Ireland. There's a beautiful, beautiful area called Warren Point, and this is around there. And it's a beautiful area, and he said that this was the inspiration for the rolling hills of Narnia. Also, if you're in Belfast these days, they've built what's called the C.S. Lewis Square. It's a square where there's lots of statues from Narnia. For example, Aslan, I think the White Witch is there, and there's this statue called the Searcher, which is a statue of C.S. Lewis stepping into his wardrobe. By the way, if the box with my face is covering anything, you can just move it around if it's annoying. I apologize if it's annoying you. Okay, anyway, that's C.S. Lewis. Now, I'm afraid we're doing a whistle-stop tour of the literary tour of the UK. We're going to have to now go to mainland England, and the best way of doing that is we get on a ferry. This is what a ferry is. When I do this tour in real life, often the American students that I take on tour, they don't know what to expect with the ferry. We take the ferry quite a lot in this country. If we need to go to France or we need to go to Ireland, we get the ferry. The ferry's great fun, okay? They have like amusement arcades, they have a bar, they have cafes, shops. anything. It's a great time. I was on a ferry with Mara last year, I believe, on the way to Ireland. So we're going to get a ferry all the way from Belfast across to England to the port of Liverpool. This is going to take quite some time. So yeah, in real life, you'd have time for a sleep, put it that way. But we're going to arrive. We're going to head down this way, past the Isle of Man, and down into northern England to the port of Liverpool. Now, I bet you wish that we had time to stop off in Liverpool. You could even get your photographs taken with these guys. Liverpool's favourite sons, the Beatles, left to right, Paul, George, Ringo, and John. Sadly, we haven't got time to stop here. Well, I'll give you, and behind them, you can see this, probably the most famous building in Liverpool. This is called the Liver Building. On top of it, you'll see a statue of a bird. That's the liver bird. And this is very important, actually. This is not to do with literature, so I'm diverting here. But this is very important in the history of America because all the millions and millions of people that emigrated to America from Europe, a huge majority of them would have come through the port of Liverpool. So say if you were coming from Poland, you'd travel all the way across Europe, the continent of Europe, get a boat across to Britain, make your way to Liverpool, and then you'd get a boat from Liverpool to America. So one of the last site you'd ever see of European soil probably would be the Liver Building here, as you can see behind the Beatles. As I say, we haven't got time to stop here. I'm afraid we're going to have to get on the bus and head north. I'm sorry about this bad map. It was the best one I could find. We're going to head north, past Preston, past Lancaster, up to the town of Kendal, very famous for their mint cake. And beyond Kendal, we're going to go to the national park known as the Lake District. The Lake District, as you can see from this photograph, is absolutely beautiful. It's very famous for lakes, for mountains. This is quite a Scottish-looking landscape. Most of England doesn't look like this. It's a very unusual landscape for England. It's also where England's highest mountain is. That's Scafell Pike, 2,992 feet high, which is by Scottish standards, not very high and not very high at all. But it's got a lot of literary associations. There's a famous book for children called Swallows and Amazons. I don't think it's particularly big in America. Correct me if I'm wrong, by Arthur Ransom. But also one woman who's very famous, I've already mentioned her earlier, is this woman, Beatrix Potter. So she, like C.S. Lewis, started off, she was quite a lonely child. She didn't go to school. She didn't have many friends. She was brought up by a governess, which is like a tutor. And she was a biologist, a botanist, an illustrator, a writer. And in her 30s, she started writing these children's books. And the first one she wrote was The Tale of Peter Rabbit. And it was a huge success. And she made a lot of money very quickly. And she moved to the Lake District and moved into this lovely house here, which is in the rural Lake District. It looks very Beatrix Potter, doesn't it? It looks, you can almost imagine Peter Rabbit in the garden here. And she bought a lot of, as she got richer and more successful, she bought more and more of the land around her. And it's actually, she's partly responsible for the Lake District being so well preserved as a national park. Everywhere you go in the Lake District, you'll find Beatrix Potter stuff to buy. If you want to buy a Beatrix Potter candlestick, a Beatrix Potter pencil case, an ashtray, you'll get it in the Lake District. And her life ended quite well. She got married at 47. She ended up being very happy, very successful. And here's some of her books: Peter Rabbit, Benjamin Bunny, Squirrel Nutkin. When I was a kid, these books were very big. I don't know if kids still read them today. Again, let me know if you did. But wonderful books, wonderful illustrations as well. But yes, moving on. The most famous literary association with the Lake District are these guys. These are the Lake Poets, okay? The Lake Poets are named after the Lake District, and they were from the movement that we've referred to now is like the Romantic poets, the English Romantic movement. William Wordsworth, very famous. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, amazing poet, very famous guy. Robert Southey, slightly less famous, but also a great poet. And there was other people as well, people like Thomas de Quincey, even Lord Byron, the bad boy of the English Romantic poetry, went to visit them. Wordsworth was born in 1770. He was in France at the time of the Revolution. He was very keen about the Revolution. He famously said, bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. That's the very famous quote from him about the French Revolution. He soon went off the French Revolution, moved back to England, and him and his sister, Dorothy, who was his lifelong companion, moved to the Lake District to this house here, Dove Cottage, which you can visit if you go to the Lake District in a small village called Grasmere, which is beautiful. It's an absolutely beautiful part of the country, and you can visit it and you can see where Wordsworth and Dorothy lived. And he lived around Grasmere for the whole of his life, the rest of his life. And he became a very successful poet. And I'm going to read some of his poetry. There's a very famous poem that we learn at school in the UK. Maybe you do in America as well. But first, we'll talk about Coleridge as well, because here's the other great romantic poet that I'd like to talk about. You must remember, especially for any of you who are younger, that at this time, we're talking about the 1700s, we didn't have rock stars, we didn't have movie stars, none of that. So basically, being a poet was about the edgiest, coolest thing that a person could be, right? It basically meant that you spent your time reading and writing, thinking deep philosophical thoughts, and everybody thought you were really cool, okay? And you were really clever and really cool. And people like Byron was an absolute heartthrob at pinup, right? They were kind of like, you know, I might be out of touch, but maybe like the Harry Styles of their day, if Harry Styles had ever read a book, that is. Maybe he has. So Coleridge, second one. I apologize to any Harry Styles fans. Coleridge was an amazing guy, okay? They say that Coleridge was one of the last people to have read every book that had ever been published, right? That might seem unfeasible, but actually at the time that he was alive in the late 1700s, not that many books had been published, and he was a very voracious reader. So it seems likely that he had, in fact, read every book that had ever been published. He was hugely clever, but he was also very troubled. He was a drug addict, an alcoholic. He was an opium addict, basically a heroin addict. And he was a disaster with money. He fell out with everybody because he owed them money, but he also wrote some incredible poems. He wrote The Ballad of the Ancient Mariner. Does anybody know that? It's an absolute epic narrative poem. He also wrote one that I'll read a little bit of later on, okay? But Wordsworth, let's do Wordsworth's famous poem. And this is very much rooted in the Lake District, The Daffodils, you must know this. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. Sorry, I had to do that quickly because I'm running out of time. This is Kubla Khan. This is the very famous poem by Coleridge. And I don't want to be a bad influence on anybody watching this, but he wrote this whilst he was in a drug haze, asleep on the lawn in the Lake District. But I'm only going to read a little bit of this because it's very long, but I highly recommend you look it up. It's an incredible poem, and you'll see it's very different in style to Wordsworth. It's very ancient. It seems very ancient. It's Kubla Khan. Kubla Khan was the palace of Genghis Khan, the great Mongol king. So it starts off, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf the sacred river ran, through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. Okay, check it out, it's amazing, okay? So that's them, guys. We're now gonna have to leave the Lake District, and we're gonna head back down south, back down towards Yorkshire, okay? So if you can see Kendal on the map, where the blue circle is, we're going to head down. If you see where Leeds is at the bottom, just to the left of Leeds is Bradford. Now, Leeds and Bradford are in a county called Yorkshire. I saw that somebody said in the chat box earlier on that they used to live in Yorkshire. That means that they're going to be very offended when I do a Yorkshire accent, because people from Yorkshire, they talk like that. We've got very strange accents in the United Kingdom. We've got all sorts of different accents, depending where you live. I'll stop after that. But we're going to drive on the way to our next destination. We're going to drive through beautiful scenery. This, for example, is the Yorkshire moors. Okay, it's huge moorlands that are very, very pivotal to our next destination, because our next destination is the small village of Haworth. in Yorkshire, okay? Haworth, Haworth. And Haworth is, as you can see, a very, very traditional rural village, and it wouldn't be famous were it not for the people we're going to talk about, okay? They lived in this house. This house was the vicarage, because the people who lived in this house, they were part of the same family. And here is a plaque to tell you who these people were. The Brontes, okay? The Brontë family. Charlotte, Emily, and Anne are the most famous ones, but they also had a brother called Patrick Branwell and two other sisters who died. Again, like so many other writers, they had a very unusual childhood, okay? They lived in this house. Their father was the vicar, the parson. He was hardly ever in the house. He left the children alone for most of their childhood, and they created all these incredible imaginary fantasy lands, and they wrote these very elaborate fairy stories, and they really spurred each other on, and they were very close as well. Out of the sisters, 3 of them wrote books. 2 of the books are very famous. Anne wrote a book called Agnes Grey, which not a lot of people have read. I haven't read it, I confess. Maybe I will one day. But Charlotte wrote a very famous book called Jayne Eyre, which is all about the struggles of the eponymous character in her search for love with Mr. Rochester. It's a great book, but it's not as good. Oh, sorry, here's a picture of Anne, Emily, and Charlotte, left to right, Anne, Emily, and Charlotte. Jayne Eyre is good, but it's not as good as this one, Wuthering Heights. This is the big one. If you ask me, in my humble opinion, Wuthering Heights is probably my favorite English novel of the 19th century. It is a ferocious book. I reread it recently as an adult, and I didn't realize when I read it when I was young quite how brooding and sinister it is as a book. Emily Brontë was 30 years old. She'd never really left Haworth, this village in Yorkshire, and it's so much darkness in the book. It's very claustrophobic. It's the story of 2 families who live in 2 houses. All the action takes place in 2 different houses, basically, which makes for a very claustrophobic atmosphere. And in one house, Cathy and her brother, their father brings back an orphan called Heathcliff, who turns into this very dark, brooding character. But it's also this very torturous love affair between Heathcliff and Cathy. If anybody hasn't read it, I highly recommend it. It's an absolutely brilliant, brilliant book, but it's quite dark. It's quite a dark book. It's not light in any way. And this is the inspiration for the real Wuthering Heights. The Wuthering Heights in the book, they describe it so well. It's on the top of the moors in Yorkshire. It's bleak. It's windy. It's up in the winding, windy moors. Does anybody know the Kate Bush song? In fact, Mara was playing it in the introduction to the tour. It's a fantastic song as well, by the way, by Kate Bush, Wuthering Heights. But this is the inspiration for the house, they say. This is a house called Top Withens. It's a derelict house now. And every year, thousands and thousands of people come to visit the Brontë house, and they make the 3-mile walk from the parsonage in Haworth up to Top Withens to see Wuthering Heights. And the first time I went there was with an EF tour, actually, and I was so excited because I love the book so much, and yeah, incredible. And here's Heathcliff. This is Ralph Fiennes, the actor, playing Heathcliff in the 90s movie. It's not a bad movie, but please read the book first. You can't really make this book into a movie. You can't really do it properly. But Heathcliff, the character Heathcliff, was, they say, based on the Brontë brother, Branwell. Now, Branwell was a ne'er-do-well, as we say in this country. His father, the vicar, the parson, he basically, because his daughters were girls, he basically presumed that they were just going to spend their life either get married to, they were sort of lower middle class, so they'd either get married to somebody in the community, or they'd be, they'd help around the house, basically servants. And he pinned all his hopes on his one son, Patrick Branwell. And he gave Patrick Branwell all the family's savings to go to London to train to be an artist. Branwell spent all the money on a high life, became an alcoholic, drug addict, had lots of disastrous, torturous love affairs that all went nowhere, moved back to Yorkshire in disgrace, and died very ill, very unwell, and was a very tortured soul. And people say that Emily was very fond of her brother Branwell, and she based the character of Heathcliff on her brother. Heathcliff's a very dark character. He's one of the great dark characters in English literature. Sadly, Emily Brontë died a year after Wuthering Heights was published. Wuthering Heights was very unsuccessful when it was published. Jayne Eyre, on the other hand, was very successful. And Charlotte Brontë was very ashamed of Wuthering Heights. And when Emily Brontë died, she tried to actually suppress it and destroy it and stop it from being distributed. But eventually it caught on, and now it's considered an absolute classic. It's an incredible book. Next, we're going to head down from Yorkshire, where they talk like that, and we're going to head all the way down. So I'm afraid don't follow the red line because we're near Leeds. Can you see Leeds? We're near Leeds, and we're heading down to number 2, Stratford upon Avon. I'm sure you all know why we're going to go to Stratford upon Avon. This is what Stratford upon Avon looks like. We've just spent 3 hours in the coach driving down here. Maybe we played some games on the bus. We like to play lots of games on the bus. And we landed here in Stratford upon Avon, which is in a part of England known as the Midlands. The Midlands, as you can guess, is called the Midlands because it's not the south, it's not in the north of England, it's in the middle. In the Midlands, they have a very strange accent. It's so strange that I'm not even going to try it. Ozzy Osbourne, he is from the Midlands, okay? So his accent is a Midlands accent, like a Birmingham accent. The Birmingham, they talk like that. So Stratford upon Avon is famous for one thing and one thing only. This guy, William Shakespeare, okay, the greatest poet and author, certainly in the English language, possibly in any language of all time, okay? 1564, he was born. It's an easy date to remember. Now, Shakespeare was born, he wasn't born into a hugely affluent family. A lot of the writers we're talking about today were from quite wealthy backgrounds. His father was a tradesman. He went to a normal school. He was well versed in the classics, Latin, Greek classics. He would have known the Bible inside out. And he was obsessed with Greek and Roman writers. He loved Ovid and Homer, those sorts of people. He was born in this house in Stratford. You can visit this house today. Some of you probably have. This is Shakespeare's birthplace. It's now a museum, which you can visit. And there's members of the Royal Shakespeare Company do impromptu scenes from his plays in the backyard, which is always fun. And he was born in this house, and he, after a long and relatively successful career in London, he moved back to Stratford and died and is buried in this church, Trinity Church, next to this river. This is the river Avon, okay? Stratford upon Avon. Avon is the river. We have several river Avons in England, but this is the one in Stratford. And he's buried in that church there, in Trinity Church. And the other famous building in Stratford upon Avon connected with Shakespeare is this. This is Anne Hathaway's cottage. Anne Hathaway has got nothing to do with the Hollywood film star. Anne Hathaway was Shakespeare's wife. Shakespeare married her when he was 17 and she was 10 years older than him. She was 27 and she lived in this house with her parents and her siblings, which would have been quite an affluent house. And Shakespeare, it was a shotgun wedding, I'm afraid to say. He got her preggers, as we say, and then they got married and had several other children. And then Shakespeare, young William Shakespeare, did the honourable thing. And upon having given his wife 3 children, he ran away to London to become an actor. So nice one, Shakespeare. The other famous thing about Shakespeare and his wife is that when he died a very wealthy man. Do you know what he left her in his will? He left her his bed. That was all she got in his will, was his bed. So nice one, William. William moved to London, became an actor. Nobody really knows what happened to him for quite a long time, but presumably he was having a tough time, struggling, like being a struggling artist. And after being an actor for several years, he started to write, and he became gradually more successful. And he was writing in the time of Queen Elizabeth I, and then King James I after her. And a lot of his plays would have been geared towards the royal audience to try and gain their approval. At the time when he was writing, the theatre was not the respectable thing it is now. The theatre was seen as being rather crude and not the sort of thing that a sophisticated person would go anywhere near, okay? If you were sophisticated, it was the church and that was it. Okay, the theatre, if you were actors weren't allowed to be buried in municipal graveyards. They had to be buried outside the cities, same as prostitutes, okay? So acting and the theatre was very much looked down upon in Shakespeare's day. But despite that, he managed to do rather well. He was also a good businessman, invested wisely, made a bit of cash, moved back to Stratford and made a lot of money and did very well. And after he died, some of his colleagues, some actors, put all his plays together in what we call the first folio, which contained all his various plays. And then since then, he's become the most famous playwright in any country in the world. And I must say that here's a list of all his plays, okay? Comedies, the histories, the tragedies. Some of you are probably of school age, I imagine. When I was at school, I couldn't stand Shakespeare. I didn't understand the words. I found it draining. It was tiring. But as an adult, I recognized that Shakespeare is a complete genius, okay? What he deals with is universal truth. His use of words, the plots of the plays are almost immaterial. His use of words, he deals in basic truths, human truths, which are as applicable today as they were in his time. A lot of his stories he actually borrowed from other plays, and he just took the play, like Hamlet was a play from Denmark, and he just changed the script. But his scripts, his words, his poetry was what made him very, very unique. And in fact, so much of what he wrote we use today in the English language. These are some of the well-known expressions that we use still today that originate in Shakespeare plays, okay? So knock, knock, who's there? That's from Macbeth, okay? A heart of gold, as used by Neil Young. To set your teeth on edge, faint-hearted, good riddance, so-so, fight fire with fire, seen better days, send him packing, to wear your heart on your sleeve, not slept one wink, that's from Shakespeare. The game is up, to wait with bated breath, the green-eyed monster. These are all from Shakespeare's plays, okay? So nobody else has done more for the English language than Shakespeare. And remember, the words that you use in your language affect your universe and affect the way you think, affect the way we think and our ancestors before us. As I always like to say, words create worlds, okay? And nobody has created more worlds with his words than William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare, an indisputed genius of the English language. And that's the final word. So moving on from Stratford upon Avon down to Oxford, you'll see another idiosyncratic map that I've made for you here. So follow the red star from Stratford down to Oxford. Oxford is a very famous university town. It's the oldest university in England. Originally, the university would have just been for theology. The only reason why you'd go to university would be to learn theology. But since then, they took on more and more courses, and now it's the most famous university, certainly in Britain, if not the world. So many famous people went to university there. You know, you name it. Bill Clinton, Oscar Wilde, Evelyn Waugh, pretty much every prime minister of the United Kingdom, they all went to Oxford. But another very famous thing about Oxford is the Oxford Dons. The Dons are what we call the professors in the university, and some Oxford Dons have also been very famous writers. I am getting somewhere with this. This is called punting. If you're a student at Oxford University, you go punting on a boat. You've got a long pole and you push yourself along the River Isis, which is actually the River Thames, which flows through London, but it's got a different name in Oxford. And one very famous trip on a punt was taken by an Oxford Don one day in the 19th century. This Oxford Don was this guy, Lewis Carroll. He was a professor of mathematics at Oxford University, and he was a weird guy, not very sociable. He was very interested in mathematics, photography, but he was friends with one of his colleagues had some children, and he was good friends with the children, particularly one of them who's called Alice Liddell. And one day when he went out punting with the children, he started telling them a story that he was making up on the spot as he went along. This story eventually got published and is better known now as Alice in Wonderland, and its sequel, Alice Through the Looking Glass, which are fantastic books for children, much beloved by people through the ages. Very bizarre books, very sort of surreal, use very surreal imagery. you can see how they might have been written by a mathematician, because it's a very sort of strange logic that's applied to them. But also this guy, he was an Oxford Don, J.R.R. Tolkien. He was a Don of English. As I said, he was very good friends with C.S. Lewis. And him and C.S. Lewis had a drinking club. The drinking club was called the Inklings, and they would meet and go to the pub, and they would talk about shared interests such as obscure Norse dialects, mythologies, theology. They were both very, very interested in theology, and both very devout Christians, as I said earlier on. J.R.R. Tolkien knew so much about obscure ancient Norse dialects that one day he started writing about Middle-earth, partly as an excuse to use all this knowledge that he had about these ancient dialects, and he ended up writing these books, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, okay, also written by an Oxford Don, J.R.R. Tolkien, made into movies. Movies aren't too bad, but again, I'm afraid to say, not as good as the books. And this is rural Oxfordshire. This is the area around Oxford, and you can see how this was the inspiration for the Shire, where the hobbits live, in the books, in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Lots of beautiful green rolling hills. All the area all around Oxford is very beautiful. It's near a set of hills called the Cotswolds, which is where extremely affluent people live. It's where David Cameron, people like that live, just outside Oxford, where Winston Churchill lived. It's almost, you could compare it to the Hamptons, perhaps. It's like the Hamptons of England. But it was the inspiration for the Shire as well in The Lord of the Rings. Now, where are we next? This is the Eagle and Child. Sorry, this is the pub where Tolkien and C.S. Lewis used to go and argue about trolls and orcs and things like that. I'm joking, I don't think they argued, but they used to go and have very interesting conversations about all their obscure knowledge with various other colleagues as well. And the informal name of this group was the Inklings. If you go to Oxford, you can visit this pub. It's on a street called St. Giles, right in the centre. And they also sell award-winning beer. Some of you may be excited to see. Okay, and that's it. Finally, we're going to head to London, where we're going to get you on an aeroplane. You're going to go on an aeroplane back to the States. But just before we get into London, let's talk about a couple of writers in London. This is the metropolis of London, you can see. Geoffrey Chaucer, he wrote the Canterbury Tales around 1400. Fantastic, bawdy books. Canterbury Tales, here you go. Who else have we got? Paradise Lost, John Milton, incredible epic poem all about the fall from paradise of man. It's incredible epic poem written by John Milton. He was blind. He dictated it verbatim to a scribe who wrote it down. Check that out. And William Blake, also an incredible artist, poet and writer. Very strange guy indeed. I would highly recommend you look him up. I could talk to you about him for hours, but I've run out of time. And who else have we got? This guy, I would say he's the main London writer, Charles Dickens, okay? Nobody writes about 19th century London like Charles Dickens. He came from a very poor background, very difficult background. His father was in debtor's prison, and he wrote a lot about his experiences in more working class areas of London in his books, such as Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol. You might know the Muppets version. Very good movie, that one. David Copperfield, Bleak House, Little Dorrit, A Tale of Two Cities. Fantastic books. A very prolific writer, Charles Dickens. Great national treasure. Who else have we got? Jane Austen, not from London, from further south. Bath. These are people I haven't got time to talk about. I could ask me questions, I might be able to answer them. Robert Burns, representing Scotland. So yeah, basically I've left out lots and lots of people. If we had 7 days in a bus, I'd be able to get through more, but that gives you just a brief overview of some of the fantastic writers from the UK. Yeah, please ask me any questions, and I will endeavour to answer them in the Q&A. I'd like to thank Mara again very much for giving me this opportunity to work. As she said, it's been a tough year for us, so it's fantastic that I get to do this. And thank you all very much for joining me. Thank you.
George, thank you. I'm going to jump back on and share my screen. Let's see if I can manage to do this quickly. We're going to go to a Q&A, but firstly, I have to share a little personal story, is that my mom is an English teacher, and she is older now and retired and really late in her life. But when I was a young student, I studied in London for a year, and I had a hard time coming home. So my grandfather sent my mother over to bring me home. But before we came home, we did pretty much what you just did, but we did it in 10 days, which was a literary tour of the UK. And she took me to many of the places, including like Brigadoon in Scotland, and Brontë Sisters, Yorkshire. And I remember a lot of that fondly with my mother. So thank you very much for bringing that back for me. And I know that there were a couple chats of people remembering some of these stories from their grandmother, who was a librarian, and some of their days as a study abroad people as well. So thank you very much. I mean, that was really, really a great tour, and extremely touching and meaningful for me and several other people who are on. We're going to go to Q&A at this point. I have up a slide that is going to tell you, one, that we can accept Q&A in the Q&A toolbar. So just click on that toolbar and start putting your questions in, and George will start to address them. But in the meanwhile, I have chatted you how to tip the tour director. Please know that there is no amount too small, and there's no amount too large. So anything in there that feels comfortable to you, please feel free to tip them, and I will make sure that everything gets to George after I collect it for you. But I'm stalling a little bit because I'm giving George a little bit of time to read the questions. But George, are you ready?
I haven't even started.
Oh, okay.
No, that's okay. Mara, should I be able to see myself?
You don't need to, George.
No, I definitely don't want to. Okay.
Everybody else can see you, so you're
Good.
fine.
Okay. Here, question 1 from Kathleen Duffy. Did poets make a decent salary? The impression one gets from movies is that they were always poor. I think that they were always pretty poor indeed. I think some of them were from very wealthy backgrounds. They did all right. Lord Byron, as his name would indicate, was a lord. So he probably didn't have to struggle too much. It was probably quite easy for him to run around the world, gallivanting around. The headstones, these are not all family, but the people in the town. Yes, that's from Haworth, the Brontes. I presume so, yes. I'm in Australia. My grandmother's a librarian at 7:35 a.m. and I've already cried sentimental tears this morning. Her bookshelves were lined with C.S. Lewis and Beatrice. Okay, great. Thank you. How much did the culture of the time affect the success of certain books like Wuthering Heights? Wuthering Heights was not successful at the time. People found it very disturbing and bleak. It took a long time. It was more in the 20th century that it became the hugely successful book that it is now, the hugely respected book that it is now. What about the, here we go, I knew this was coming. What about the controversy regarding whether Shakespeare really wrote the works attributed to him or to another English author, or whether he lived at all? Okay, well, my simple answer to that, if you'll excuse me being so crude, is who cares? We have the work, who cares where it came from? But I suspect, for what it's worth, in my opinion, that he did write the work. There's lots of conspiracies about Shakespeare. Another famous conspiracy is whether he was a closet Catholic or not. At the time in the UK, that was a really big deal. And lots of people think that there's a lot of secret code in his plays to indicate that he was actually a secret Catholic. At that time, there was a huge underground network of Catholic priests and such. Did his children, Shakespeare, amount to anything? His son Hamnet died very young, very sadly. His daughters lived on and had families, and there are still relatives and ancestors of Shakespeare alive today. Do folks in the UK take seriously the notion that Shakespeare might be a pseudonym? I answered that already. Okay, this is a good one. Which Shakespeare work would be a good one to read first? Okay, I've got a great answer to that one. The answer is Macbeth. Macbeth is a very dark play. You'll notice that I like all the dark stuff. It's a very dark play, but it's also quite a short play. And it's basically an anatomy of evil. Macbeth is an evil guy. He murders the king. He's a bad guy through and through. And it's basically a chronicle of his going mad as a result of his evil. So it's a really interesting sort of look into the sort of like an anatomy of evil, if you like. If you have the time, tell us a bit about Blake in the Q&A. Blake was a like quite a lunatic. He spoke to angels, he spoke to demons. He was very esoteric. He had very strange things that he got up to in his private life that I won't go into here, but he was also extremely religious. He came from a very poor and modest background, but he's incredibly gifted artist and printer, printmaker, writer and poet, very unsuccessful in his lifetime, but now hugely revered. I mean, just check out some of his images, some of his etchings online, absolutely incredible. Could Samuel Coleridge read languages other than English? Yes, absolutely, definitely. He was a complete and utter genius. He could read, I'm sure he could read Greek, Latin, German, French. I know he could read German because he wrote a lot of books about German philosophy. He introduced certain German philosophers into English. He wrote lots of critiques of Schopenhauer and things like that. How long does the tour take in real life? I think about 8 days. Welsh writers? Absolutely Welsh writers. I didn't go into them because I was actually just following the itinerary of the EF tour. Welsh writers, Dylan Thomas, I mean, you know, so many. What was the name of the movie with Angelina Jolie? It's BEOWULF, BEOWULF. Read the book. Thanks. When things get back to normal, what museums in London would be your favourites? They're all good. The British Museum, the V&A, the Imperial War Museum, all good. This is a great question. Do you visit the hometown of George Eliot? No, we don't. But George Eliot is a writer that I really should have included in this tour, and I should have mentioned her at the end. George Eliot was a woman. George Eliot makes it sound like she's a man, but she had to write with a pseudonym because people didn't take women writers seriously at that time. She wrote Middlemarch and various things, but her books are fantastic, all about working class communities in the 19th century in the Midlands. Thanks for showing the Moors. They're an important part of The Secret Garden, one of my favorite children's books. Yes, also a great book. I haven't read it for a long time. Can the Beatrix Potter house be toured? I don't think so. I'll have to look into that. The answer is I don't know, but I don't think so. Charles Williams, the third Inkling. I don't really know anything else about him. I don't know that much about him. I suspect he was a Oxford professor as well, probably very clever. I think he was a poet. Okay, Marla, when is this tour scheduled? It's not scheduled, it's hypothetical, but if you look on the EF website, you'll be able to see the UK literary tour, and you can always request me. Thank you very much for this trip. Can you send a list of your favorite books to read? So many. From what we've been talking about today, I would say, look, Wuthering Heights is incredible. Middlemarch by George Eliot, incredible. I mean, I love French writers, Italian writers, German writers, so many. What's your favorite literary house to visit? Without a doubt, the Brontë sisters, the parsonage in Haworth. I love visiting Haworth. Where in the UK was Jane Austen located, related to the places you spoke about? Jane Austen lived in the southwest of England. So if you go to London, then go west and then further south. She was down there. She lived all over, but she lived for a period of time in a town called Bath, but she was very unhappy in Bath. She didn't like it there at all. I think the rest of the time she lived somewhere like Chichester or somewhere like that. Faye Valentin, when will you do Scotland? Anytime Mara asks me is the answer to that. I believe that my friend Lewis already did Edinburgh, but I could do a more general Scotland. We could do the islands and the Highlands, talk about the history and the literature and the culture. How do you know details about Shakespeare's personal life? Because I'm very, very clever. Where was Keats from? He was from Hampstead in London, which is an area in North London. You can actually see his house, Keats's house, right next to a very big public park in London called Hampstead Heath. You can look it up online, actually, Keats' house. Can you tell us a little bit more about the importance of Chaucer's literature nowadays? Greetings from Argentina. Wow. Chaucer's literature. Chaucer was a fantastic writer. I mean, you wouldn't understand a lot of what he wrote because it's written in Old English, like when that April with his sure suitor, the drocht of March hath pierced to the rooter. That's the opening of the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. But he's quite bawdy. If you know, do you know what I mean by bawdy? It's quite rude. A lot of what he talks about, it's quite slapstick and rude. There's a lot of sort of quite rude adult humour in Chaucer's book. I won't go into too many details, but it's very funny, but it's not sacred by any means. It's quite profane. Any contemporary UK writers you like? I mean, yes is the answer. A lot of contemporary writers I like. Let me try and think of one. Can't think. Let me get back to you. What did Emily Brontë die of? I'm sorry, I should have said this. She, as well as Charlotte Brontë, died sadly of tuberculosis. She died at the age of 31 of tuberculosis. I think most of the Brontë sisters died of TB. It's very unlucky family in some ways, also very lucky in other ways. Why do you think there's a new interest in so many English novels? I don't think it's new. I think you know, the cream rises to the top, as they say, and I think the good books do eventually get their comeuppance. My fave is Dickens. Who is yours? Whoa. Shakespeare. Of the authors who was very famous during their actual lifetime, C.S. Lewis was very famous. Dickens was extremely famous. Who else? Charlotte Brontë was successful. You know, all the Tolkien was very successful. Lewis Carroll, hugely successful. Influence of Brit lit on American lit, inevitable, I think. Yes, I mean, absolutely. If you think about American literature, I mean, it's hard not for everybody who writes in the English language not to be influenced by Shakespeare, Milton, Dickens. Yeah, so I mean, completely inevitable. What's your take on Christopher Marlowe being the real author behind Shakespeare? No idea. I did a high school term paper on this. Absolutely no idea. Could be true. You know, I don't see any reason why Shakespeare didn't write everything. You know, people had more time to read books and be clever back then. I find it very interesting that Shakespeare never left England. He wrote all these plays about Italy and Denmark and things, but he never really left, you know, Stratford and London. Everything came from his imagination. I've tried to read Wuthering Heights many times and can never seem to get through it. I find the language pretty difficult to get past. Do you have any tips that would help? I can't remember it being that difficult because it's written in the 19th century, so it should be using by and large the same words. Maybe you have to persevere, or why don't you try listening to it as an audiobook and see if that's easier. Not really a question, but there's a great movie by Kenneth Branagh about the end of Shakespeare's life, worth a look. I haven't seen that. Rachel Peake, thank you very much. Okay, somebody was disappointed that there wasn't Jane Austen. Jane Austen wasn't included on this tour because she's not included in the tour that I was basically mimicking, the EF tour, which I normally do in real life. But yeah, Jane Austen, fantastic writer, Pride and Prejudice, Emma. If anybody's seen the movie Clueless with Alicia Silverstone, that's a great movie, I think. It's like a modern remake of Emma by Jane Austen set in Beverly Hills. If there's any younger people here, I'd say that's a great way to get into Jane Austen. But yeah, she's a fantastic writer, huge fan. How do you know so much about literature, George? Do you have a degree? No, it's because I'm quite old and I've been, I do have a degree, but it's not in literature, it's in history and French literature. Yeah, I guess I've read quite a lot over the years, yeah. What has Bath to offer? Bath is beautiful. It's a Roman town, a Roman spa town. You can see the Roman baths there. If you're interested in Jane Austen, you can visit her house where she lived. It's incredibly beautiful Georgian architecture. It's got a lovely river. Lots and lots is the answer. Since Shakespeare left only his bed to his wife, but he died rich, who did receive the rest of his money? His children. How about Hardy and Dorset? Rhonda Sullivan, 10 points to you. I love Hardy. Hardy is very, very depressing, though. It's some of the most depressing books ever by Thomas Hardy. He was also from not far from Jane Austen in the southwest of England, where they all talk like that. They all sound a bit like pirates. But Hardy wrote Jude the Obscure, Tess of the D'Urbervilles. incredibly depressing books. If you really want to be really, really depressed, read Thomas Hardy, but they're also fantastic. I lived in Oxford for 2 years, many decades ago. Your talk today is reminding me of the wonderful stories I heard in the most fervent of my heart's filled with one wonderful. Thank you, Linda Barron. Do you do tours centered around Jane Austen novels? Not yet. Can you talk about Enid Blyton? I don't know, not much. No, I don't think so. I'm sorry, no. Did the Brontes or Jane Austen write under any other names to hide they were female? They didn't, actually. That's a good question. They didn't. As I say, Emily was very unsuccessful in her lifetime. Charlotte published under her own name and managed to do quite well. Which publisher has the best Chaucer footnotes? I was supposed to read the Canterbury Tales in one of those dreaded survey classes, and I have hated his writing ever since. We'd like to try again. Kathy Wandle-Mayer. Yes, it's not easy, Chaucer, but what you want to do, you want to get the original text and a modern translation, and maybe persevere, or maybe do a course online. You could find a lecture about all the different, because it's broken up into the different tales. The Wife of Bath is the famous border. Maybe start with The Wife of Bath because it's very rude, and that might inspire you to persevere because it's kind of rude and bawdy. Wendy, I understood that in Beatrix Potter's day, women were not allowed to draw human figures, so she drew animals with clothes, and that developed into her characters. Do you know what town she grew up in before she was wealthy? I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. I don't know about the women were not allowed to draw human figures. Sounds unlikely, but it might be true. Do you do James Joyce in the tour? Not on this tour, because he's from Ireland, and then he lived in Paris. But when I'm in Ireland on tour, I do a lot of James Joyce. I love James Joyce. How did literature in the UK affect cultural diffusion? Star Nakamoto, that's a very highbrow question. The cultural diffusion, well, the cultural diffusion is ongoing. It's every day, isn't it? So I guess literature would have affected it in some ways. Yeah, I mean, we have different literature coming from different countries all the time. I'd have to think about that one to answer that adequately, I'm afraid. Did the Bronte sisters support themselves from the sales of Jayne Eyre? Charlotte certainly made some money. She ended up also getting married later on in life to one of her father's helpers. But I don't know exactly what she did with her money. Charlotte was quite sensible. Charlotte was the sensible Bronte. Emily was the dark, moody, unsensible one. Tennyson, he was also one of the romantic English poets, a fantastic poet. Can't think of anything off the top of my head to tell you about him. Maybe we should do a whole separate session on the Lake poets, or poets, British poets of the 19th century. Cheryl, I was in the Lake District 25 years ago. It was beautiful. Has this area been preserved, or has it been commercialized at all? It's not very commercialized. No, it's preserved, very preserved. It's like a national park, but you do get some small villages and towns there. Are we able to tour Charles Dickens's house? There is a Dickens museum in London in Bloomsbury, which is very interesting, and you can tour his house. There's various items of interest. There's a letter that he wrote to his wife in there that's very famous because he wasn't very nice to his wife, sadly. Seems that many of the great writers were victims of great pain, tragedy, or other misfortune. Do you think this reality played a significant role in the brilliance of their craft? That's a tricky one because I don't want to make any young people watching this think that in order to be brilliant creatively, you need to suffer, because that's not true. There's lots of artists that didn't suffer at all, but there is a certain romantic ideal, particularly in the 19th century, of the impoverished, suffering artist, and maybe it's specifically work of the 19th century that we really associate with that, not just in literature, but also in art and music as well. Far from the Madding Crowd is the most romantic novel ever. It is a romantic novel, great movie as well, and that is Thomas Hardy. Who did Lord Byron have an affair with? The answer to that is absolutely everybody. What town did Agatha Christie live in? I can't remember exactly. I think she probably lived in London for a while. I just remember that she ran away to Harrogate in Yorkshire for a while when she went missing at some point. Was Arthur Conan Doyle Scottish? He was. He's from my hometown, Edinburgh, which is where I am right now. Do I know Geoffrey Archer's books? I haven't read any. The Moonstone was the very first detective novel by Wilkie Collins. It could well be true. I haven't read it. I don't know the answer. Sorry. James Joyce, we talked of him. Did the church frown on the writings of Chaucer, the wife of Bath? John Spitzieri. It's a very good question. I don't know the answer. I would imagine so. It's very rude. But maybe at the time it was moving in very different circles to the church. But I'd need to investigate that further. Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning. Yeah, good question. Melody Holtzman, both fantastic writers as well. Yes, they definitely deserve to be mentioned. Can you still use the baths in Bath? You cannot, but you could in the night. My father used to swim in them in the 70s. But no, now it's a museum. You're not even allowed to dip your hand in. But any Cambridge professors, famous writers also, yes, they definitely were. Well, I mean, C.S. Lewis ended up being a Cambridge professor for a start. I would need to look. I'd need to look that up. Sorry. James Joyce isn't included. He's in Dublin, not the UK. From Australia. Hello. Was Virginia Woolf from London? She was. She was part of what we call the Bloomsbury set. That was her and people like Maynard Keynes and various friends, and they all hung out in Bloomsbury. But later on in life, she moved to Sussex, to the countryside. Do I do poetry readings? I enjoyed your reading of The Daffodils. Thank you very much, Amanda Briggs. Jane Austen was self-published. Were any famous male authors? Did any famous male authors resort to that? I'm sure they did. Yes, I can't think of any off the top of my head. Most famous author for reading about the Isle of Wight. I'm sorry, I don't know, Marcy. I love John Fowles. Where is Lyme Regis? Lyme Regis is down in the south of England. Am I an Ian Rankin fan? Well, Ian Rankin writes a lot about Edinburgh, my hometown, and I've read a couple of his books, and I do like them. If you're from Edinburgh, they're very exciting. Where was Mary Shelley from, and where did she write Frankenstein? She was from London, and yes, she wrote Frankenstein, and Mary Shelley and her parents were both very, very important social reformers as well. Mary Wollstonecraft, thank you for the tour, it's been wonderful. Nothing off the top of my head that I would feel secure talking about. Murder in the Rue Morgue by Poe is considered the first mystery novel. That's correct. I remember that being said, that Edgar Allan Poe wrote the first detective novel. Lisa Scott, are you an English professor? No, I'm not, but thank you very much. Do you have a favorite British mystery writer? Nothing that springs to mind. I like Ian Rankin, he's good. Who else do I like? Mystery writer. I mean, I like John le Carré. It's not mystery, it's more like spy books. But that's the kind of book I read if I want some entertainment. If you were to talk about Scottish authors, what would be different in their style compared to authors from the rest of the UK? It depends on which type. There's so many different Scottish authors. Nothing necessarily. Some Scottish authors do write in the Scots dialect, but a lot of them just write in normal English. So yeah, you get certain Scottish writers that do write in Scots dialect. Lewis Grassic Gibbon is a fantastic Scottish writer. Irvine Welsh famously wrote Train Spotting. He's a good writer. He writes in Scots. Is there a tour? Here we go. Is there a tour about Irvine Welsh and his writing? I believe there is. Yes. Currer Bell and Acton Bell and Ellis. Don't know. Sorry. Brontë pseudos. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know anything about that, Kathy. But thank you very much. John, did the church frown on the writings of Chaucer? Yeah, basically, I don't know is the answer to that, I'm afraid. Do you ever tour James Herriot's area, All Creatures Great and Small? That is also in Yorkshire, where we were for the Brontes. James Herriot, very, very Yorkshire, where they talk like that. Kathleen, thank you very much. Thanks very much for coming back. I enjoyed it as well.
Okay. That looks like we have wrapped up the questions, and you were pretty good, George. You knew pretty much every answer, which
No, well,
the Q&A is always the time to, it's like the test rapid fire 100 questions. How much do you really know about the subject matter that you presented? And you always score with flying colors. So
thank you very much. I'm glad you think so.
Yeah, I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing your knowledge and your passion with us. And mostly I do want to thank the participants, because obviously without our participants, we wouldn't be able to continue to do these, and there wouldn't be a demand for them. So as long as there is a demand for these tours, we will continue to put them together. So you can drop a line in the chat, or you can send me an email and tell me where you'd like to go off to next virtually. I do have a slide up right now, which gives you all of our future virtual tours and their dates that they're planned for. I do have several in the works that are coming up, and I'm planning through the winter. So please know that we will continue to travel virtually while we can't travel physically. But if you do have any questions about my physical tours or virtual tours coming up, please don't hesitate to contact me. I just want to say thank you again, and thank you to George. You were awesome tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Mara.
With that, we're going to close out the meeting or the event, and have a good night, morning, day. We have people from all over the globe on this. So cheers and enjoy the rest of your time.